So without much further ado, I will pass over to Jonathan. So Jonathan Green is the Manager for Carbon and Environment at the Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation. In 8 years at the ILSC, Jonathan's led a $37 million program to establish new Savannah fire carbon projects in the Northern Territory that now includes over 5 million hectares of Aboriginal land producing carbon credits, jobs, caring for country and cultural reconnection for traditional owners. Jonathan's currently working to roll out projects in Cape York, funded through the Queensland Government Land Restoration Fund, and these projects commit $30 million in funding to development and operation of new Savannah projects in Cape York. Jonathan's also working with Aboriginal landholders to implement human-induced regeneration and environmental planting for carbon projects in other states, and has been involved in the ongoing development of the Savannah fire methodologies, including work to extend the scope of the methodologies south of the Savannah zone. He's a member of the steering committee that established the Indigenous Carbon Industry Network and is active in advocacy for Indigenous interests in carbon. Thanks, Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks very much for that intro, Rachel. So just by way of a bit of explanation about me presenting it to you today, Rachel's given a bit of a heads up on that. So the Indigenous Carbon Industry Network was going to be presenting. That didn't sort of turn out. So as a member of the steering committee for ISIN, I was asked if I'd like to present on their behalf. So I think ideally from an Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation perspective, we like to have our Indigenous project partners presenting and talking about their projects that we're supporting rather than us directly. So it's a little bit unusual in this one. But what I'm planning to do is give a very brief sort of overview of what the Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation does. And then I'll follow on to a presentation from the Indigenous Carbon Industry Network, which I've popped over onto my PowerPoint, which is the one that they would have given today. So I'll do my best to talk to those slides, but of course feel free to jump in and ask me questions. It's only a small group, so more than happy to clarify anything as we go along, or save some time for questions afterwards. Okay, I'll start presenting. Okay, can everyone see that slide? Yeah, great. Okay, so that's just the intro slide. So the Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation, so the ILSC was set up in '95 to provide for the needs of Indigenous Australians in relation to access to land. So that was mainly in response to the Mabo decision back in '93, I think it was, that determined native title, the following native title legislation. So out of that process, there was a recognition that many Indigenous people and their countries were alienated from any landholding rights. So the Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation was set up in acknowledgement of that to support people in those areas to access the funds to buy land and to regain important parts of their country. The other role of the ILSC is to support Indigenous people who do have land access, to support them to actually manage their country, develop projects, businesses, activities on their country, where they may be rich in land but very poor in any resources or access to capital. So they're the sort of the twin functions of the ILSC. Yeah, so I won't dwell on these slides too much. I think that sort of overview covers most of it. But yeah, this is since the ILSC started back in 2005. These are some of the achievements to date here. So yeah, I think we've had a good impact as an organisation. So now, without further ado, I'll move on to the Indigenous Carbon Industry Network slides. And I encourage all of you to have a look at the Indigenous Carbon Industry Network's website, which is up the top there, icin.org.au. So there's some fantastic resources you can access on that website, which will help you if you're thinking about or planning to engage with Indigenous landholders or interest holders within your regions. Okay, so, and there's also some great little stories and other bits and pieces on there that help to paint the picture of Indigenous carbon. So what is the Indigenous Carbon Industry Network? It's now a incorporated entity. It's got a fully Indigenous board. It represents the coming together of 35 Indigenous owned and operated carbon projects, and it's seen to sort of fill a critical gap in supporting the sector. So it aims to bring together the participants in those carbon projects, so the rangers, project operators and managers, to discuss common issues and opportunities that are faced by the network. Yeah, and so you can see there a broader network including over 1,000 people with 35 head organisations there. Yeah, so established in 2018 as an interim licensed steering committee, so working on the development of the Indigenous Carbon Industry Network, and then went through to launching as a corporation earlier this year with a fully Indigenous board. So you see the board members listed there. So state of play in the Indigenous carbon sector. There are 35 operating Indigenous owned and Savannah fire burning projects, enabling the fire management over 18 million hectares in North Australia. So if you're not familiar with the Savannah fire methodologies, they work by looking at the baseline of emissions from wildfire in a certain on a certain property over a 10-year period before you wish to start the project. And then the project actually attempts to reduce the area burnt and therefore the emissions on that property below that baseline that you got for the 10 years before you started. So it's the science here, has never really been questioned to any great degree. It's pretty straightforward. Obviously there may be some questions around some other methodologies that were raised on 7:30 last night, but we don't consider there's any particular risk that those sorts of concerns would apply in the Savannah space. It's fairly straightforward. When country burns, it releases a lot of smoke, nitrous oxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. If you reduce the area burnt each year, you reduce the amount of emissions. So that's mainly how most projects operate, but we are seeing, and we expect to see more and more over the next year or two, projects starting to include sequestration in the project. So that's starting to look at the carbon that's stored in trees, standing, living and dead trees within the project areas, and actually be able to include that carbon in the projects as well. And we expect to see up to a 4- to 5-fold increase in the carbon abatement potential on the Savannah country when those opportunities are realised. So yeah, it's a pretty exciting time for the Savannah space. So the Savannah credits represent about 1.2 million carbon credits generated each year, and we saw carbon prices go over $50 for the first time earlier this year. And at that sort of rate, you're looking at a value of $62 million a year being generated in the north. So yeah, I mean, if you consider that though a lot of that country wasn't really generating any significant income before these projects, it's a fantastic and a massive change in the management of those areas to reduce serious wildfires and the environmental harm they cause, and also suddenly you've got a lot of revenue that can be fed back into the land management aspirations of the Indigenous people in that country. So one of the key things here is those sort of co-benefits are a really significant thing. So the co-benefits of better environmental management, people getting back on country, people bringing out the TOs to get involved in doing things like cultural burning and fire walks and things like that. And when I have the opportunity to go out and meet people working on these projects. And I ask, oh, what do you think? Is this good? What are you getting out of it? Often those things are really to the fore of their minds. Those co-benefits are what they're excited about and what motivates them. They're not necessarily highly focused on, right, we're going to try and make as much money as we can from this piece of land this year. So, and the value of that is recognised in the marketplace as well. So we see that carbon credits from these Indigenous projects are often earning a 20% premium on the rest of the market. Just in recognition of those stories, those wonderful outcomes that go hand in hand with the Indigenous approach to doing a carbon project. Yeah, so this is just a slide reflecting on that carbon price boom that we saw earlier this year. We saw since the end of the carbon pricing mechanism, the carbon price was set by the Emissions Reduction Fund auctions, and that sort of languished at around $13 for several years and slowly grew up to about $20. And then it sort of skyrocketed over the last summer up to over $55. And it's just sort of, I guess it's an interesting time for the sector to sort of absorb these sort of price shocks and work out what the future holds. But it's a bit of an exciting time. I think it may have been driven by a bit of speculation by buyers and traders being, cognizant that we've got the 2030 emissions goals starting to kick in for various corporations and states and things like that. So, presumably the pressure on supply is going to be fairly steady over the next few years. We have seen a response to that in that the Clean Energy Regulator has lessened the commitments in existing emissions reduction fund contracts. So they're allowing some of those contract holders to actually take credits that were committed to the ERF auction through to the government through the ERF process, and actually be released from some of that burden and actually sell into the voluntary market. And that intervention has probably contributed to the price drop we've seen recently, where it's back around the $35 mark. And we may see it stay there for a while as a raft of vegetation projects start to come online as well. So it's a bit of a crystal ball gazing activity here. I guess the interesting thing for project development is you need to have an estimate of the carbon value to work out if you can run a viable project or not. When the price goes up, areas that would not otherwise be viable suddenly become viable, and the scope of potential carbon projects in your region may be suddenly be doubling overnight. So the Indigenous Carbon Industry Network hosts a Savannah Fire Forum each year, usually in February each year, and it aims to bring together all the people and the rangers as much as possible that are involved in the Savannah fire sector. And here's just a bit of a snapshot of the priorities that the people participating in that survey, what they enjoyed about their projects, and what sort of motivated them to be involved in the sector. So you can see here again, you do see revenue down there, but on the bottom line, but it's the size of these symbols here represent how significant those aspects were, and there's a really big emphasis for people on just collaborating, getting engaged, learning, communicating with each other, sharing their knowledge about fire. They really are enjoying getting out there and managing their country in a way that's consistent with the way their ancestors would have done that. Meeting their cultural obligations, self-determination. So through these sort of projects, having more confidence about it, what they want to do with their country, more capacity to engage in things like regional forums and so forth, and of course the employment outcomes. And this is also reflected here, where you see, participants who are asked where they're reinvesting their funds from carbon projects, and this is the full range of various things are being supported here, without any one of them being much more significant than the other. But of course, a lot of money rolls back into operational costs each year. But we also see things like supporting intergenerational exchange of traditional knowledge. Like a lot of Aboriginal projects really do want to spend a lot of time bringing traditional owners, different members of different generations out to the project areas, and getting them out on using the fire project as a vehicle to get people out on country and to do these sort of cultural activities. And that's a really big priority. So where does all this sort of thing potentially apply, I guess, is what you might be asking. So here's a map that shows areas of Australia that have some form of Indigenous legal right attached to them, shown by the block colours there. So if I just look at the classes there, the grey ones are, you're looking at exclusively held native title lands. So that's Aboriginal land. Some of it may be leased to national parks under, you can see, if you know where Kakadu is, for example, Kakadu comes up here as a Aboriginal land holding, but it is leased to Parks Australia, for example. But in these areas, Indigenous people, if there's a carbon project going on, it's their project. They'll be sort of consenting to it. They may have partners involved that are non-Indigenous partners or companies coming on to help them deliver their project. But at the end of the day, it's their land and their project. And the green areas are what's called, so the areas where native title has been settled to some degree. So that's where the land, in most of those green areas, is a pastoral lease holding or a crown lease of some sort. And native title has been determined and allocated to a traditional owner group. So there's a prescribed body corporate that's been formed that represents the native title holders of that piece of country. And no carbon project can go ahead on any of those green lands unless that prescribed body corporate has been involved in the consultation and provided their consent to the project. And then the class 4 areas there, or the yellow areas, that's where native title claims are pending, or so those areas may become green at some stage on this map. In those areas as well, there is an expectation that any developer will engage with native title claimants and seek their consent for a project. And of course, in the other areas, it's an interest. There may be no legal requirement for any engagement with native title holders, but of course, an entity like the Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation or Indigenous Carbon Industry Network would consider it best practice to reach out to people from the country where you are and talk to them about the country and what you're proposing to do. Just as a form of respect. So what we can also see on this map is the clear polygons, and they represent existing carbon project areas. So up the top there, the blue outline shows Savannah projects. Orange here is mainly human-induced regeneration projects, and we can see some sort of pink spots there and a few other little tiny spots around the place, and they represent the soil carbon and the forest and other vegetation projects. That's where people are growing trees or monitoring the soil carbon in their soils and aiming to get a carbon credit through those processes. So the biggest opportunity for Indigenous land, it's fairly clear from this map that most of the country that is Aboriginal land in Australia, being that central portion, is outside the zone of current carbon project areas. So there are currently not many opportunities for carbon projects on a lot of Aboriginal country in the drier zone. That may change with some work the ILSC is supporting at the moment to bring the Savannah methodology down south into the northern Tanami and the Kimberley area. So that will greatly increase the Aboriginal land available for carbon projects. And we're also seeing the development of a new methodology that's been developed by the Clean Energy Regulator called the Integrated Farm Methodology. So that methodology may largely replace the human-induced regeneration methodology. The human-induced regeneration methodology requires any project area, so that's where you're regrowing trees in area that was cleared in the past. Any project eligible in the human-induced regeneration area must reach a 20% tree canopy to be eligible. We expect in the integrated farm methodology that 20% restriction will go, and that will mean that vast areas of arid country that may never reach 20% could, even though it could end up in an integrated farm management project as a carbon project. But, you know, having said that, the carbon per hectare in that country is quite low. So you would need large projects. You would need satellite scale verification of outcomes rather than on-ground monitoring. And so there's various bits and pieces that need to be developed and fall into place for that to work. Yeah, so here's some other future opportunities here. I've already touched on some of these. Everyone's been very excited about blue carbon for quite a while. We're seeing the first methodology roll out at the moment, which is restoring mangroves and estuarine areas, in estuarine areas, and saltbush areas, where there's been some sort of sea reclamation in the past, so removing those barriers and letting the sea come back in to allow those sort of marine environment carbon stores to build back up again. And the scientists tell us that those carbon stores are potentially way higher than what you might find in the tropical rainforest. So it is exciting, but the areas where that methodology apply are fairly limited. So the really exciting thing is what comes next in blue carbon. Are we going to start looking at seagrass and other forms of blue carbon? Where can that apply? There's still a lot of scientific work to be done. Another methodology that Indigenous people are quite interested in is wild herbivore management. So that's, for example, things like removing camels or removing buffalo in Arnhem Land. We know that those animals cause a lot of ecological damage. If they're obviously ruminants, so they're producing a lot of methane. There are some limitations around having a method that's just based around culling animals, but there may be some way of integrating one of the existing methods called the beef herd methodology to tweak that to include some of these other herbivores. And there's also some work going on to look at some of the some of the international carbon standards, like the voluntary carbon standard and the gold standard, to see if they can offer any support to do a methodology around those animals. So that's an area that's there's some ongoing work looking at that. So another thing I wanted to touch on is revoked projects. So these are projects that have got established, they've done all the mapping, they've got their permission from the pastoral leaseholder, and they've been revoked by the regulator because something went wrong. And in at least some of these, I know that the proponent was unable to gain consent from Indigenous landholders. So a lot of work was done, a lot of monitoring, estimation, viability assessment, et cetera, and in some of these at the last minute, someone thought, oh yeah, we better actually chat with the PCB down the road and see what they think. And they weren't very impressed about being contacted at the last minute and told to sign on the dotted line. So there really is an imperative for anyone getting involved in carbon project development to not shortchange Indigenous interest holders, and to actually really prioritise getting involved and talking with them and forming a relationship as one of the first sort of cabs off the rank when you're starting to look at a project. The Indigenous Carbon Industry Network has produced a really excellent guide to help people down that path. So I recommend anyone, if any of you are interested in it, to find this guide on the Indigenous Carbon Industry Network's website. So icen.org.au. Check that out, because it does provide some really helpful guidance on engaging with Indigenous people, working through the implications and the decisions they need to make, and potentially supporting them through that process. So these are Indigenous Carbon Industry Network priorities at the moment. So there's work going on to understand the support Indigenous people to understand the carbon sector, so producing fact sheets, story reports, videos, etc., looking at some of the major methodologies that overlay areas of Indigenous land interests. There's some work going on to scope the carbon industry, Indigenous carbon industry opportunity, so looking at Indigenous land holdings across Australia and the sorts of methodologies that might apply in that country. And also what barriers to access and engagement there are and how they might be tackled. One thing we've seen recently is, there may be opportunities coming out and being supported through the NRM regions, like the Carbon Plus Biodiversity program and things like that. But one thing we find when the ILSC is trying to facilitate engagement around that and to join the dots between a property and an opportunity like that, the Indigenous community need to come to a collective decision about the opportunity. They need to collectively understand the carbon the carbon market, how to operate a carbon project, what obligations they're taking on, and come to a collective decision. So it's it can be a very time-consuming process. The right people might be hard to get into a room together, and these things do need to take a bit of work and a bit of explaining and support. And I think we generally see a very low uptake of these sorts of opportunities, often because there's not enough time allowed for Indigenous people to actually really get into the meat of these opportunities and toss them around and bring them to community forums and work out what they need out of it. So that I guess that's something to bear in mind when you're engaging in the regions with Indigenous landholders, to maybe prioritise getting out to them first and talking about the opportunity. So co-benefits, there's some work going on there to summarise the co-benefit opportunity and work out how best to sort of communicate that to the market. We know, as I mentioned earlier, that there are market players who are very interested in the co-benefits attached to Aboriginal carbon projects, keen to support Aboriginal people in their land management and landholding aspirations. And there may be some work required to sort of support members to build up their ability to talk to those sorts of opportunities. And that's a little bit further around that. That's supporting Indigenous project participants to talk about their story, the outcomes that they gain from the projects, and how best they can go ahead with that. All right, that's the end of my slideshow.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Jonathan. That was a really great overview about the potential for Indigenous involvement in carbon farming projects and Indigenous-led carbon farming projects. Thank you very much for stepping in to do that. Have we got some questions from the floor? I'll just get you to unshare your screen so that we...
Oh, okay, sorry. I'll just try and work
out. Fantastic.
I'm just going to try and work out how to do that.
I might be able to do it for you.
Oh, good.
I can actually.
I can't see the thing.
Okay.
Oh, thank you.
Fantastic. Now, that was a really, as I said, it was a really great overview. If no one else has if other people are still thinking of their questions, I'll go with one that I had to start with. So I was just wondering, I think there's been some cases where Aboriginal people haven't given sort of consent for I suppose their carbon credits to be marketed using their stories and so on. So you touched on that being sort of a key co-benefit, and I was just wondering what your experience is of that, and how people can make sure that doesn't happen with any projects they're participating in.
Yeah, that's a really really good question. It's and I think that's definitely one of the reasons why working on the co-benefits information resources and support is a priority for the Indigenous Carbon Industry Network. What we have seen in the past is entities buying credits from Indigenous carbon projects, and I won't name names, but there have been entities that have bought, say, 500 credits from a project in a Indigenous carbon project in Australia, and 10,000 credits from a project in Vietnam or somewhere, and then they do that once, and then the spiel and the marketing goes on for year after year that they're doing this. so that's obviously something that we're not seeing so much of anymore. But there were a few instances of that in the early days. So we in Iceland especially encourage Indigenous carbon operators to, when they're selling credits, to put some sort of clauses around that in their sales contracts, to say, you're entitled to talk about supporting us, and within these parameters. So there's a bit of a lid on that, so it doesn't just sort of go on and on forever.
Right. Thanks, Jonathan. I think, Fiona, you had your hand up, and then I think Laurel had her hand up.
Sorry, I was just unmuting. I was actually just clapping. I was using the clap.
Oh, you were using
I didn't have any questions, but it was an excellent presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks,
Thanks, Fiona.
Sorry I mistook your hand. And what about you, Laurel? Did you have a question, or were you clapping also?
No, I don't think if I've done anything, that was an accident. Sorry.
Okay, that's all right. No worries. Did anyone else have a question?
I actually did, if I might, Rachel. I was
of course
stepping back a little bit as well. Jonathan, good to see you, by the way, if only on Zoom, and fabulous to hear about the work that you're engaged in as well. I'm curious, and it's something, I guess, that is a good one for us to talk directly to the network about, but what you might perceive as some of the positive relationships we could establish almost at the national level between an organisation such as a cooperative body between NRMs and a cooperative body like ISON, and how you might see that playing out as someone who participates.
Yeah, well, it's a question better directed towards Anna Boosted in ISON. But yeah, I think there's a lot of good could come out of collaborating. For example, just that work that I mentioned there, where ISON's looking at producing some information sheets and fact sheets about supporting Indigenous people to understand and engage with the carbon sector. It'd be wonderful to make sure all the NRM regions have got access to those materials and can use them. And I think, even like small steps like that can build a good relationship. And there's opportunities for there may be opportunities for people working in their region to even reach out to ISON directly and ask about engaging with the people, the traditional owners in the region they're working in, and how they might sort of go and tackle that. For example, just to share some experiences around that. And I think there's a lot of scope for collaboration.
Thank you. It is good sometimes getting the perspective of someone who's just sitting a bit alongside. So much appreciated.
I think it'd be fantastic if there was.
Thank you.